Freedom Day is here, but can we truly define the millions of our masses who still live in abject poverty as free? Some analysts believe that it'll take a few more generations to right the inequalities of the past and bring about true freedom for all. Well, we've asked Professor Dirk Kotze, a political analyst, to define for us what freedom means for South Africans from different walks of life on this day. Professor, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Good evening.
Well, every South African professor has their own definition and version of what freedom is and what it means. And it suffices to mention that each and every version or definition differs from all the age groups, from all the racial groups, and across all the social classes. So what's your version of what freedom is?
Well, freedom, as you indicate, refers to many different things. For some, it is more about political freedoms. It's about political rights. It's about human rights. It's about the ability to exercise their choices, to have the freedom to make choices. For others, freedom is freedom from fear or freedom from want. It's freedom from what they are not having, in the sense, especially from a socioeconomic point of view. And we've seen it also in the past when opinion polls were done about what is the meaning of democracy. It is very similar to these points. Some see it more in a formal sense in terms of procedures and constitutional rights and constitutional institutions like parliament and judiciary. Others see it in a more substantive way from a socioeconomic point of view, having access to housing, having access to education and healthcare, and to food, obviously.
Well, Professor, you've just touched on the right or the power to act or speak or think in a certain way or as you want. But I guess then we should be careful that this right does not encroach on the right of others. So how then should South Africans strike the balance between freedom of speech and respecting the rights of others?
Well, freedom of speech in terms of our constitution, first of all, is limited. We have in our
Hi, Professor, are you there?
Constitution limitations on all these rights. But at the same time, I think some of the rights in the Constitution already one has to balance it against those who are claiming the other rights. For example, the right to dignity, the right to have freedom of speech, the right to have being able to enjoy your religious freedoms. These are always in relation to other persons, and those rights that they enjoy or they want to exercise. So it is, rights are all the time in relation to others. It's not only about the person in isolation.
Do you think South Africans are free, Professor? Or I suppose I should then narrow down the question or the conversation to whether the different racial groups or the different social classes are free?
Well, this is a very much loaded question, and it's going to depend on the person who's going to answer this question. For some persons, they will say major changes have happened since 1994. And others will say, well, those changes didn't work for me. It didn't produce a better quality of life for me. So it's impossible from a South African point of view to generalize about it. And it's very much based on the position a person occupies in society, the class position, the professional position, the position of the historical implications of that. All of that plays a very important role. And I think this is what makes it so difficult for government also to implement policies, given the diversity in South Africa and the fact that people have different expectations, and at the same time they have different interests also. It's not different from other societies, but I think in our case it's much more pronounced in the sense of the differences between the different groups.
But then, Professor, without generalizing the issue, from what you've seen, from what you've heard, from what you've experienced, do you think South Africans really are free?
Well, I think to in some degrees, yes, definitely. I would say in a political sense, despite all the political differences that do exist, if we look at it from a constitutional point of view and the constitutional principles that guide the political activity in South Africa. And despite all the criticisms and negativity that exists, I think in a political sense we are certainly to a large extent free. There's very small oppositional groups that feel that the Constitution don't accommodate them, don't give them the rights that they can enjoy. Again, when it comes to the socio-economic aspects of society, it's very much a different situation. And there, because of the inequalities, the scarcity of resources, the inequality of those resources, there is a sense amongst the big percentage of the South African population that they, in that respect, are not yet completely free.
Yeah, but then those who are free, I mean, if you say that South Africans are free in a way, one then wonders, free from what? Because we may be free from the shackles of apartheid, from racial segregation and oppression, but then 26 years later, if South Africans are free, they are free from what?
Well, as I said, they are mainly free from the political limitations, the political discrimination, the political threats of the past. What is still absent is that there's freedom from want, freedom from not having what a person is supposed to have or need to have in order to have a decent or quality of life. Freedom from security sometimes, or freedom from fear about security. We think about domestic violence. We think about rape and other forms of criminality in society. We have freedom from the fear of not having a shelter. That's another. It's all aspects of what we collectively can call human security. And that is that these socioeconomic aspects in many respects are not sufficient or are completely absent. And that creates a sense of insecurity.
Well, Professor, you're quite right there when you say the definition of freedom is very broad and it takes the form of different facets. I mean, we need to focus on the various facets of the societal, social fiber. I mean, the government certainly cannot boast of having brought about freedom. I mean, how can you say people are free when South Africans all over the country are still stuck in a 2 meter by 2 meter shack, which is leaking in these unfavorable weather conditions?
Yes, well, I think, and that's where the notion of a social compact that President Ramaphosa is trying to promote very much, I think is very much relevant, is that he is saying it cannot be done only by government. It is something where the different components of society or sectors of society will have to come together. And what he is promoting, and even now during the time of the pandemic, but even also earlier on in his State of the Nation address, and other major addresses, is when he's saying that there must be a collective approach to it. It must be the main sectors of society must come together and talk and reach together decisions about the direction in which the society and the politics of the country must continue. And I think that's a very important approach. If it is only the responsibility of government, then obviously there's going to be not the necessary progress being made, because there's always, in government or in politics in general, there's always this tendency of scarcity. There's scarce resources, there's scarce capacity, there's scarce infrastructure. And therefore, because of that element of scarcity, it's not possible on its own for government to address all these matters.
Now, so much has been said and little done with regards to the land question. And to this day, Professor, it still remains unanswered. Do you think that the land question should also be brought into the conversation of what freedom is in South Africa and what it means to be free?
Yes, certainly land is a very important component, but it is not the only one. In some political movements, for example, elevate it to the most important or almost the only one. But we are seeing the modern society where we are living in, even if it is for people living in rural areas, is that the South African economy, the South African society is diversifying very quickly. And there are many different ways in which a person can make ultimately a living, or having a career, making success in life. One of it is in the form of using land, whether it is for agricultural purposes or for other purposes also. And I think this is where South Africa differs from countries like Mozambique or even Namibia or Zimbabwe to some extent, or other African countries where land is more prominent. In the case of South Africa, the majority of the population is actually urbanized. More than two-thirds of the South African population is already urbanized. And for the urban population, land means a different thing than for persons living in rural areas. So from that point of view, we have to have a perspective of how to use it also for different purposes. Land, for example, in the urban area is much more important from a accommodation, from a housing point of view, while land in the rural areas is much more of a productive commodity or a productive means in order to make an existence or living.
I mean, what about the vast tracts of unused land in South Africa when there's millions of South Africans still stuck in shacks and even don't even have a roof over their heads?
Yes, that's exactly what I meant. That there are different purposes and different reasons why people need land. The point I want to make is one cannot generalize about it. For some people, land is of historical nature. It is about their identity. It's about their tradition. For other people, it is for commercial purposes. It's to make a living. For other people, it is in order to have a shelter, to have an house, to have an accommodation, in order to be able to make a living also. So that's why I'm saying land, we cannot overgeneralize about land. Land is something which is used and plays a different purpose for different persons depending on where they are. And I think that is what has to be understood by everyone is that land is exceptionally important, especially from an emotional or symbolic point of view. And no one can deny that. That's absolutely a fact about the life of South Africans. But how to implement it in a way in which it can also support their living, the way in which they exist, I think that is something which much more should be added to it. But what is lately happening, I think, is more recognition is given also to the role that land plays in urban areas than before, when it was seen mainly as an agricultural or rural matter.
Right. Now, Professor, how do we right the wrongs of the past? Or should we right the wrongs of the past? I mean, looking at the fact that social cohesion still remains a fallacy in South Africa, we're still experiencing high levels of racial polarization. Should we right the wrongs of the past, or just go on with our lives as though nothing happened, but still live within the confines of the law and respecting the rights of others?
Well, from a moral point of view, from a human rights point of view, from a constitutional point of view, no one will be able to argue that we can just leave it as it is. If there's, and it is so, that if there's lots of inequality, if there's lots of socioeconomic situations which is unacceptable, which is a product of or result of the past, or it's a result of certain systems that worked, that should be addressed over time. You know, the objective of any government, of any society, ultimately, is to improve the quality of life of all its persons, all the people living in that society. Well, you can talk about the idea of a moral society or a just society. It sounds idealistic, but ultimately that should be the objective. But I think where there are differences of opinion between the different political movements or political parties is how to do it. You know, who should take responsibility for what, and how much should they take responsibility? For example, the more liberal approach is saying a lot has to be done from the private sphere. The more sort of social democratic approach will say the society, the community, or the state has a much more important role to play. And that is where the political debate is about, you know, is what should be the predominant approach, or what should be the balance between those, because it's seldom that it is the either of the one. Normally it's some form of combination of these, the private and the public, and the balance between the two. that will have to address it. But there's no question, and we as South Africans should be very much aware of the fact that it's not even an urgent need. It's absolutely important, absolutely necessary, that we should become a society where there's less inequality, where there's less poverty, where there's less unemployment, and where there's a more inclusive society and there's a more inclusive economy.
Now, Professor, just before I let you go, one age group that is missing from this conversation or from this debate are the born-frees, who remain largely despondent into issues affecting them on a daily basis. And there's a bit of an antagonism between the old guard or the older generation and the younger generation. And do you think that South Africa's older generation should fully understand and appreciate the younger generation's despondency when it comes to issues such as these?
Well, I don't think that is really possible. I think the young generation, the so-called millenniums, as well as the born-free ones, they are living in a completely different world from where I grew up, or many other persons also, just from a generational point of view. They look at life also in a sense from a different perspective, that looks to be the case. And I think there are very different expectations. I think what is in a sense very much predominant now is that the way in which they look at their future might be more, in a sense, uncertain. For example, we know that the idea of having permanent employment in future might be less. It will be much more casualized type of employment. It will be more contract type of employment. It will be also a lot more self-employment in many cases. It will be very much like almost what I would call the Uber type of economy. That seems to be like the norm in the direction in which we are going. It means that there's also the possibility for more initiative from persons. They don't necessarily have to be employed in order to make a success of their life. The digital economy or the digital world is something which is, I think, that they see as the future for themselves. They simply need to have access to that and to have some tools in order to be able to enter that world. But I think in that sense, their world perspective differs quite a lot from many others in our society.
You got right there, Professor. It differs vastly, and it's so easy for the old guard to tell the younger generation to go get a job. I mean, what job? From where? When there aren't any jobs available. But Professor, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your thoughts and your reflections on this Freedom Day.
Thank you.
Professor Dirk Kotze, a political analyst, joining us via Skype.